Hey there, it is Kyle Boone, aka Strong Jaw staff writer at CBS Sports. Welcome to the Eye on College Basketball Podcast YouTube channel. We've got a special show today. Adam Finkelstein, director of scouting at 247 Sports, is here with me today. And the draft is, believe it or not, just over a few weeks away. We're fortunate to have him on the YouTube show today, starting a new series, breaking down some of these best players by position. Today, we're going to start with the wings. We've talked a little bit off air, and I know we are going to have some disagreements, so I'm very excited to dive in with Adam. Adam, of course, comes to 247 from ESPN, where he's been scouting a lot of these prospects for many more years than I have. This is, for me, I really get familiar with some of these prospects at the college level. Adam has been scouting these guys, since they were freshmen in high school, sometimes even younger. So curious to see where you have some of these guys. We're going to essentially do this countdown style. Adam has a list. I have a list. And we'll just count it down. We'll definitely have some crossover. I know we have the same guy at number one. I'm curious to see in what order you have yours. So we'll just do 5, 4, 2, 1. Adam, you are on the clock at number 5. Who is number 5 on your board?
All right, so the 5th best wing on my board, and I think we should maybe start with a little bit of a disclaimer first that, like, in this day and age, everybody who's not a center or a point guard, somebody's going to call a wing. But I think on our board, we're trying to stay keep that list a little tighter in terms of some of the true wings. So number 5 on my board of the wings, and we're going to start with our first argument. I've got AJ Griffin at number 5. AJ is, as you alluded to, I saw him for the first time when he was a freshman in high school, Archbishop Stepinac playing for Patrick Mazzaroni, and then PSA Cardinals. He was a USA basketball product at an early age. Watched him throughout his high school years. He kind of went off the grid last year during the COVID year, but was not at Stepinac. And then he reemerged at Duke. And at the time, I was at ESPN, and we got crushed because we really dropped him in the rankings. And then his freshman season at Duke comes out, and it looks like we're right because he gets off to this slow start, and then really not doing as much as people expected. Trevor Keels is making a much bigger splash right away freshman year, basically exactly what we anticipated. And then, of course, it flips, and AJ really has a tremendous freshman year. So to me, this eval, and obviously I'm going to be interested in your take as well, but to me, this comes down to, like, what are you buying for AJ Griffin? Are you buying the shooting? Because the shooting that we saw at Duke wasn't the shooting we saw in high school.
Right.
And even though his metrics are really good at Duke, the release in my mind is still, it's just not pure. Like I don't feel great about it when it comes off his hand. He's got the really wide base in terms of how far apart his feet are. So are you buying the shooting, or do you have some reservations about sample size or history or whatever? And then how do you feel about the athleticism? Because that's the part of his game that was significantly better in high school. He was much bouncier. He was much lighter on his feet. He had those long arms. What he had at an early age was these huge feet and huge hands that made everybody think, myself included, that he was going to catch a late growth spurt. He never really did. And now, after some injuries, now you're saying, wait a minute, are those just kind of clunky feet? And is he going to get that lateral quickness or that explosiveness back? So I think that's what it comes down to. Are you buying the shooting that you saw this year? Are you buying the athleticism that we saw when he was younger? If you're buying both, then you're going to have him much higher up on your board than I do. And I suspect that's where you may be at with it.
Yeah, that's where I'm at with him. And this is in part, right, because most of the scouting I did on AJ Griffin was during his time at Duke. I've seen some highlights of him in high school, but I don't have the same context that you bring to this table. That's why I really appreciate your voice in this. I have him number 2 on my list of best wings. And yeah, hand up, like, I buy the shooting. I buy the fact that his length, I think, is going to be a difference maker for him at the NBA level. And then 2, I think the athleticism, he started the season obviously injured. Duke basically made it a point to ease him in to start the season. There was, I think, before the start of the 2022 calendar year, he didn't even play in a game more than 20 minutes. So they made a concerted effort, I think, to kind of slowly bring him back from injury. And we still really did not see kind of the same explosive athleticism that I think he really had in high school. So
right.
If you're buying AJ Griffin, which again, hand up, I'm buying the shooting. I'm buying that the athleticism will eventually come back, fully aware that, the shooting may not be exactly what we saw at Duke. And he's dealt with injuries the past 2 years. This is a theme, and maybe this is something that he's just lost in terms of his athleticism that may not fully come back to what it was at the high school level. The shot, I think, it is going to translate just because he was so good at Duke. I think if you're shooting, around 45%, which is what he was at one point, he was 50% from three during the season. I think this is going to translate. The wide base is interesting. It's certainly, I think, been obviously a discussion point. The slow release, I think, is maybe concerning if you're projecting him to be like a really high level, like number 2 on your team. But again, I think some of this stuff you're kind of splitting hairs as to, do you have him number 5 on your board, or do you have him like number 10 in this class? So willing to take the chance on him and his upside. Just knowing that, eventually I think a lot of the skills that he brings to the table is going to end up translating. So have him higher than you do, obviously, at number 2. But I think the reasons that you bring up for maybe some skepticism with AJ Griffin are very real. And I think this is a real chance why AJ Griffin is really hard to project him in this draft, because there's people who have him number 5. There's people who have him like outside the lottery, like 15. And yeah, hands up. And so I'm curious to see, like, he's one of the more fascinating prospects to scout in this draft. I'm curious to see kind of where he falls on draft night, because to me, he has star potential, but at what point are teams going to take the risk and bet on AJ Griffin, his star power? I think there's a chance he ends up slipping. Okay, number 4 on Adam Finkelstein's wing rankings, you have, drumroll please.
I've got Ochai Agbaji, who is almost the polar opposite in terms of projection from AJ, because I view AJ as kind of a high risk, high reward prospect. And I think Agbaji is kind of a high flow or low ceiling guy where, after 4 years in the national championship at Kansas, he's going to be able to come right in and impact winning right off the bat. I don't know that he's ever going to be an alpha or a primary playmaker. In fact, I'm not sure he's ever going to be a secondary playmaker, the NBA level. But I do think he's going to fit that 3-and-D prototype. I think his measurables and his body type, I think all of that translates. I think he understands how to work. He knows what it means to impact winning. He's played multiple roles over the course of his years at Kansas and been relatively successful doing it and exceeded expectations at each step along the way. So for me, he's number 4. He's a guy that I think, in terms of wings, like when you get in the bottom third of the first round and you're looking for some value on a, in that salary spot with what you're going to get at the tail end of the first round, you're going to get a guy who's a serviceable NBA contributor. And so that's why he's 4 on my board. Although I acknowledge that he doesn't have the upside as Griffin or even guys like Marshawn Beauchamp. So it really depends on what you're shooting for, how you're prioritizing your spots.
Right. No, I think that's really good context to add as well. I have him number 4 on my wing rankings as well. He's a little bit older, right? He spent 4 years in college. The NBA draft typically favors guys who are a little bit younger, so could see him slipping for potentially for that reason. But this is a guy who improved from 3-point range every single year he was in college. Was the number 1, the true alpha on a Kansas team that won the national championship. In terms of guys who I think are going to make an immediate impact at the NBA level, like Ochai Agbaji has to be considered as potentially the number 1 guy on that list. There's some really interesting fits that I think would be really fascinating, like the Pelicans taking him with their pick. I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, they need shooting.
Yeah, and so anyone I think who needs wing depth, who needs shooting, who needs someone who's really going to give a ton of effort on defense and has kind of the physical frame, I think, to hold up at that position. Ochai Agbaji, I think, to me checks a lot of boxes. So
do you think 4, he can be like a pick and roll threat? Do you think he's got any playmaking chops at the next level?
I think he does. Some of what we saw at the NCAA tournament was a little bit concerning, though, because there's times where he's almost like fading in and out. He definitely has some playmaking to him that I think is going to help, but there were times during the NCAA tournament run with Kansas where he's making things happen. He's driving to the basket. He's creating on his own. But there's a lot of times where he's more passive. He's willing to kind of take a back seat. And I'm not entirely sure what version you're going to get from Ochai Agbaji at the next level. I think it's some kind of hybrid of both. But is that something that you buy long term with Ochai Agbaji, or
I don't know. I'm concerned about kind of the lack of wiggle, the lack of change of direction. I think in college when his physical tools were more helpful to his playmaking ability in college than they're going to be in the NBA. So that to me is like the swing skill. You know what I mean? If he becomes more of a playmaker than I expect, then maybe he's going to be a little bit better. I do think he's a solid NBA player either way. He's a 3-and-D guy, but if he becomes a guy who can play pick and roll on the second side of the floor, then he's a little bit more than that.
Right. Yeah. And that to me is like kind of the debate that is probably going to dictate where he ends up going in this draft, because if he's a catch and shoot guy, he's a 3-and-D guy. That's great. NBA teams absolutely love that. And honestly, it might be a lottery pick still, but he may not have, the star power, the upside that, someone who can really create and really make things happen on the wing that maybe is going to get drafted a little bit higher. So we'll see with that. I think that's a really interesting kind of discussion point, something that is kind of swirling around Ochai Agbaji as he prepares for this NBA draft. A little bit older. There's a few things that's maybe keeping him from being like a clear top 10 guy. But certainly to me, I think obviously going to be a first rounder and probably somewhere in the top 20. Number 3, Adam Finkelstein. On your wing rankings, you have Benedict Mathurin.
I've got Arizona's Ben Mathurin, and I think he comes from that same 3-and-D prototype, but I do think he's got a higher upside long term.
Yep.
And so I the measurables are he's a little bit bigger. He's I just think he pops a little bit more. The shooting, I'm buying the shooting long term. He's younger. And I think all of those things. So he's one of those guys that when you get, like, in my mind, this draft a month ago, everybody was saying it was a 4-player draft. Now, people are saying, all right, is Keegan Murray in that category? Could Shaedon Sharpe be in that category? Mm-hmm. But after you get outside that range, Ben Mathurin is a guy to me that has potential to be a significant player down the road, almost very similar to what you were saying about AJ Griffin. Like, I just think if everything goes right for Ben Mathurin, you've got a potential high-level guy because he's going to be able to defend. He's already shown the shot making, although I do think there are some subtle balance issues in his shot that nobody's talking about. I think when he addresses that, he's going to go from a good to a potentially great shooter. We've seen him be explosive in transition, dynamic when he's got a lane to the basket. So I think there's a lot of those things. And when you look at his rate of improvement over the last couple of years, if he continues to progress along those lines, I think, again, the floor is a guy who's a 3-and-D NBA wing, but the ceiling is higher than potentially it is for somebody like Agbaji.
No, I like that a lot. And with Mathurin, I think he's someone too who, similar to Agbaji, like showed some stuff off the bounce that, maybe we didn't see like all the time, but his shooting is going to translate. I think the frame is going to translate. He's going to be an okay defender at the NBA level. Who does he remind you of, like, in terms of pro comps? Because this is one that I kind of went back and forth on. I can't like make a 1-to-1 comparison with Benedict Mathurin and an NBA player, but I know you've kind of grinded through these pro comps. And
I've spent my whole morning on this. He admittedly wasn't on my list. Who'd you end up going with?
I can't, let me pull it up here, but I think I even just left him blank because he's one who like I legit could not think of. Someone who's got, some wiggle off the bounce. He's more of just like a specialized shooter to me, maybe not like an impactful defender. Like that fits a lot of players in the NBA, but at the same time, like doesn't fit anyone specifically.
And you know what? I don't think I'm not as worried about his handle as I am about Agbaji, because I think it's like the positional size. I just think for Mathurin, it's like, all right, you don't have to be a secondary pick and roll guy. If you can get downhill a little bit, whether it's in the open floor or you got a lane in the half court, like that's going to be enough. We're not going to need you to be an advantage creator. And so, again, the youth, the size, I think that's the reason why I have him, why I'm not quite as worried about the handle in terms of being that. But I think, the comp, at least from a prototype, is that good size, high level athlete, shot maker with a lot of defensive tools. And I think there's a lot of guys who fit in that range in the NBA in some way, shape, or form.
Okay, I'm going to throw a comp at you. You tell me if you absolutely hate this one. I'm not even entirely sure I like it, and I think it kind of speaks to maybe the limitations that he has as potentially as an NBA player. Malik Monk?
Yeah, not bad. A little bigger, right? Different, like more of a more 3 than 2 in my mind, although I know those positions are somewhat outdated, but I see where you're going. Yeah, absolutely. It's funny when I have to do these comp things, I'm literally just like hour and a half staring at the page. I'm like, he's not that. I told you before, I was 90 minutes of my day was trying to come up with a comp for Ousmane Dieng this morning, and I'm still spoiler alert, all I've got is Austin Day. So if anybody's got suggestions, tweet at me.
You can spend hours on these pro comps, and you can find reasonable comparisons. But if you miss on one, they stick with you.
Yeah,
they stick with you.
No
so
doubt.
this is why we grind over these, because they really are pretty challenging. Okay, so that's number 3, Benedict Mathurin. We're going to number 2 on your list, and I have some qualms about it, but I'll let you go first. Yeah.
All right. So again, a little bit of a disclaimer positionally. Because I think so. I've got Dyson Daniels out of the G League. I think right now he's a wing. I think the hope is, or let me say this: if he ends up being as high as I have him, I think he will end up evolving into a big lead guard. So it's a little bit of a contradiction right off the bat. But I've got Golden State Warriors on the mind, and I'm thinking if you can defend and you can pass, I think that's the part that, like, when you look at the blueprint for how Golden State built their teams, everybody's like, oh, they shooting. Yeah, of course. Okay. They got arguably two of the best shooters of all time sitting there right next to each other, but everybody on that team can pass. They move the ball. And that, to me, is why you've got a guy who can defend multiple positions, who can play multiple positions, who can really pass. And it's the offense that's still got to keep coming. I mean, I think right now Dyson Daniels' best offense is bringing a smaller guard into the post, and he's got like those little runners and stuff like that. But he's got to get better as a spot-up shooter. We saw growth over the course of the G League season and during the combine, the pro day, although I put almost very little stock in that. But it did look mechanically a little bit better than it did early in the season. And so I think like that upside and the fit with the modern day NBA game in terms of being a big playmaker who can see the floor, pass the ball, play, and defend multiple positions, that's why I've got him number 2. But tell me why I'm wrong.
I don't think you're wrong. Here's the thing. I actually think he might be like a lead guard in the NBA.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure that he's a wing. He's kind of a challenging scout because like his passing, his playmaking, like his creation ability kind of reminds me of Josh Giddey in some respects. Like just a guy who maybe is not like a true lead guard, at least right now, and maybe not even long-term in the NBA, but guy who's like going to keep the ball moving. He's more of like a connector.
Yep. Ball mover, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, like the ball doesn't stick with him. He's really good kind of distributing to all the right guys. So I don't, if he's going to be a wing in this draft, this is absolutely the range I'm taking him. Like I think he's a top 10 pick in this draft.
So we're along the same lines there. It's just a matter of like how you slot him positionally.
Exactly. It's just a matter of technicality. Really like Dyson Daniels' game though. Where do you see him going like in terms of in this draft? Because seen him going like as high as like 6 or 7.
So this is the interesting part because so I think you and I are essentially saying the same thing, in that if he's going to really hit, he's got to be a big guard down the road. Yep. Because the other part of that is when you have the ball in your hands, it makes your ability to make spot up threes a little less important on the weak side of the floor. Because if you have your ball in your hands, as long as they can't go under every pick and roll, the weak side's not helping off you away from the ball. But so along those lines, I think he's got to go somewhere where they are willing to put the ball in his hands and kind of take those lumps early on. So you look at some places that have playoff aspirations in the near future. I mean, you're going to have to, you mentioned Josh Giddey. Like, listen, Oklahoma City was fine letting him and Shea and some of those other guys play through their mistakes last year. And I think Dyson's going to need the exact same thing because he is not ready to run a winning NBA team right now. But if he's going to hit as a prospect, he's going to need to be in the future. And that's all about reps.
Yep. Yeah, and I think of like the Spurs as potential fit. If OKC didn't have Giddey, I think that'd be an interesting fit. I'm
And
curious
Shea.
to see.
Yeah,
and Shea too. Ousmane Dieng is another one that like in that same range and almost in that same like archetype, like very big wing who has like really interesting playmaking potential. He's not on our list, obviously.
I was going to say, do you have Ousmane as a wing or kind of as a 4?
I like a 3.5.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So like the fact that he's 6'10" is like just he doesn't play like someone who's 6'10", right?
No,
that's the thing that.
one.
Yeah. No, exactly. So and we haven't even really got to Ousmane Dieng. He'll end up being on probably another list in our series, but yeah, like these big guys, wings, forwards, whatever you want to call them, who have like the playmaking, the passing. This is a really good draft for guys who are for teams who are looking for guys like that, who are like connector types, guys who are going to be able to play, multiple positions, can play make, can pass a little bit. Dyson Daniels is at the top of that list. And then for me,
I was just going to ask who else do you have in your top 5?
Yeah. The last one I had, so the one that we did not cover, Johnny Davis, I had him at number 5 on my list.
See, I've got him as like I think he's a combo guard.
Yeah. That's it. Again, you're just kind of like splitting hairs on exactly what position he's going to be. Number 1 on our list, on my list, number 1 on your list, Shaedon Sharpe from Kentucky, 6'6" wing, former number 1 recruit in his class, incredibly athletic, didn't play a second in college. I know you've scouted him for several years now. Like, there's not a lot of information in terms of like the draft community around Shaedon Sharpe, but give us kind of your perspective on Shaedon Sharpe, kind of the evolution that he's made from, essentially being like not a number 1 recruit to like the guy and potentially like the alpha of that recruiting class.
And to put it in perspective, even people like myself who have come up in the high school scouting world, like, we saw him last July, but July was the first time we'd been out in about 18 months because of COVID. So even before that, Shaedon, there's not a lot of info out there. In fact, just prior to COVID, he was a guy who emerged onto the scene in FIBA competition. He emerged as like a secondary weapon for, I think it was the U16 Canada team alongside Caleb Houston. And that was kind of the first time that people were like, okay, who's this guy? COVID happens. We're not out very much. When I was at ESPN, we weren't out at all. We weren't traveling at all. And then we get to Peach Jam and he blows up. And so what I saw at Peach Jam and through the film that I dug through was an absolutely explosive vertical athlete, long and chiseled frame. I think the part of his game that's overrated based on what I've seen is his shot creation potential, specifically his first step. I have not seen evidence that he gets by defenders as cleanly in a straight line as people expect in the half court, given how explosive vertically he is.
That's the thing with him is he's very explosive, like above the rim athlete. But you're saying like more in the terms of like a great dunker, but not necessarily someone who's like gonna Jaden Ivey you and just like blow past you. Yeah,
right, and especially in the half court. And I think some of it, it's a little bit of a handle thing. It's a little bit, but what I think is underrated is his shot making potential. So I think he's going to be one of these guys that as his career goes on is going to be more about creating space and knocking down step backs and things like that. I actually think he has a lot of shooting potential. And in the open floor, he's going to be incredibly explosive. So there's a little bit of, that combination is really intriguing. What I do not think he's going to be is like living in the paint in a half court game. Even still, I think when you've got that kind of size, that kind of length, that kind of vertical athleticism, open floor explosiveness and shooting potential, not just off the catch, but off the dribble. If you talk to the people at Kentucky and say like the people that worked him out, and you say like, what part of his game are you highest on? They'll actually talk about the shooting first and foremost.
Yeah.
So that's why he's number one on my board, but for the wings. But like AJ Griffin, I think he is the highest risk, highest reward proposition in the top half of the lottery.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I'm glad that we're in agreement on this one. I know we had some back and forth, some good banter. Definitely in agreement on Shaedon Sharpe at number one. Very excited for his long-term potential. Wish we could have seen him at Kentucky, by the way. That would have been fantastic, especially on that Kentucky team that really needed some shooting, especially down the stretch. Would have been really interesting. That is going to do it for today's episode. This is kind of a bite-sized episode. Adam, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciated your insight on some of these top wings. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Please go subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get all the latest episodes. We'll have more on this series in the next few weeks. So we will see you then. Take care.